Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. I'm really excited to have Johnny Bassett in our studio today from Plucky Wire to talk about story sharing. So welcome to the program, Johnny.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
And so you were, I guess, had journalism fame by being featured in a Neiman Lab article just a couple weeks ago. And I don't know if everyone was knocking on your door, but it was such an sort of practical way to get over the hump of how do people share stories without long, annoying email chains or not knowing where things are going. And so I wanted to talk to you about the magic that is Plucky Wire and sort of how you came to be where you are. But first, don't leave people in suspense. Tell us what Plucky Wire is all about.
So Plucky Wire it's a simple website that just helps newsrooms share stories with each other. So it comes out of the collaborative journalism world, and in collaboration can mean lots and lots of different things. But in this context, it means a closed group of outlets that are sharing stories freely with each other. That's what we had in New Hampshire with the Granite State News Collaborative. And I've been volunteering with them for quite a while. And so we built Plucky Wire to make their life easier so that they could share more easily with each other. But the way that we built it, it turned out that it was useful to lots of other groups all over the place. And so now we've got about 350 outlets that are using Plucky Wire and lots of different scenarios that are not just these closed collaboratives. And we're learning more and more about what the newsrooms need now that we actually have these ongoing conversations with small newsrooms all over the country. And that's been really, really fun. That's been terrific.
Well, and so this is coming out of New Hampshire. And so you're working with a lot of really small organizations. But tell me a little bit about the Granite Collaborative, because I'm not sure I'm not really familiar with what they're doing.
Yeah. So they are under-recognized, I would say, in every way. And as a New Hampshireite, I'd say New Hampshire is generally under-recognized. But
I love to see state pride.
Yeah.
Bring it on.
So they're one of the oldest collaboratives in the country. And they started in about 2018, and they really got going in COVID times. So they, like many newsrooms around the country, the newsrooms in New Hampshire, we're all sort of vaguely interested in the idea of sharing stories, but like it can be logistically very tedious, as you and I were talking about. Like if you're emailing stories with each other, that can get gnarly pretty fast. If you're looking for an old story, or if you're trying to send a correction to somebody, that gets buried in emails and becomes very scary for everybody very quick. And even if you're doing it over a Google Drive, then like Google Drive becomes real unwieldy. So in New Hampshire, they had a Google Drive with more than 20,000 stories.
Oh my gosh, that's big.
It was wild. It was completely wild. Melanie Plenda, who runs the Granite State News Collaborative, is a wizard at many different things. But the thing that has made the collaborative there so successful is that she really knows her editors very, very well. And so when COVID came around and she was talking to them and she was understanding that she's a journalist herself. And so when she understood all the problems that everybody was having, that, somebody in Keene on the west side needs something from Portsmouth on the east side. It's not a big state, but if you're trying to send a reporter 2 hours each way to cover a story, that's their entire day.
Yeah.
So Melanie started identifying the stories that needed to get shared statewide. And then at that point, I was finishing a history PhD in something completely unrelated, but I was volunteering with all these papers. And so Melanie was helping them share stories with each other. And I was helping generate some like data, like COVID data stories, things that of statewide interest. And it was as that got going that the volume of stories started increasing, such that it was clear that we needed something a little more technically sophisticated than email or Slack or Google Drive or something. And that's where it took us a long time to get to the point where we decided we would actually build something ourselves. Because as you can imagine, you
That's
don't
like
wander
passion
into
project on top of passion project. The running a collaborative is always a passion project
right.
because just that sharing, and then to decide to whip out, just a little code and a whole platform. Yeah.
Right. So Melanie is not technical. My training is in lots of things that are adjacent to journalism. I was never trained as a coder either. I taught myself because I le- I was doing research in the southern Philippines and needed to build some tools, and so I had to teach myself how to do it there. So we came to all of this with the sense of we need something practical that is maintainable by people with our skill sets and that's going to serve small newsrooms. There's no point in doing this unless it just meets their basic needs
Hmm.
and they can learn it in like 15 minutes because none of the newsrooms that we work with have any appetite for a random training on some new platform, anything
Sure.
like that. So so Melanie, I give Melanie a lot of credit because all of the hard parts of putting it together a collaborative are all of the relationship building that she did.
Hmm.
And Plucky is really just to help cut down on the tedium that is involved in actually sharing stories after you have those relationships. So if it weren't for Melanie, Plucky Wire would not exist. If it weren't for Melanie, the collaborative wouldn't exist. And it just so happened that many of the things that Melanie has learned about how collaboratives work when we codify them into software, they become useful to everybody else. And that's really the chain, like the flow of all of the things that we've learned. They come from New Hampshire. We learn about them, figure out how to make them generalizable, and then they become software for other folks. And now that we have conversations with newsrooms all over the country, the sources of information that we're getting from everybody are very diverse now. But spiritually, our home remains in New Hampshire. I'd say.
Well, and I think it's so, like the vibe or the thought that goes into software development. I mean, like, when you were developing this platform, you were coming from everyone has something to contribute, everyone has something to receive, like a very like democratic with a little d
Mhm.
kind of aspect where people are all pitching in together. And so, and I know this is your first, software project, but I feel like that's somewhat different than a lot of platforms where it's very much like there is a controller and then it gets filtered out. So it seems like a lot of input areas. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, like the the original use case was exactly as you described it, where Melanie is there just to sort of make sure everybody plays well together, but
Hmm.
then everybody is uploading and everybody is downloading to different degrees, of course, because some small newsrooms won't be producing stuff that is relevant statewide, and some of the larger newsrooms really won't be downloading that much from other newsrooms. But there is a lot of sharing back and forth. I would say that more recently we've started to work with newsrooms who are much more in the one-way distribution sort of
Hmm.
mindset. And so Plucky is only really useful to them when there's demand on the other side, when small newsrooms actually do need their stuff. And that's not true of every national nonprofit who are
Hmm.
producing excellent work, but it might not fit in the pages of a small local paper. So
Hmm.
even now that we work with outlets in all sorts of different sharing environments, by far the most important question is understanding what it is that what the news holes are that actually need to get filled. And then we can sort of work backwards from that and figure out who the producers need to be for that. And once we get both sides plugged in, then it works really well for everybody because it saves the producers a lot of time figuring out where their stuff went. And it saves the small newsrooms time because they only need to know about one source, which is Plucky, rather than the 25 potential sources of stories that they would otherwise have to independently monitor.
Right. Well, and so we were talking a little bit before we started about how you've kind of you could access content from everyone or just a couple. And so I wanted just to better understand, as a producer, what's the benefit if they're not necessarily going to be picking up stories? What's the incentive for a producer to put their content out there and perhaps, diminish it because you're putting it out there. It's no longer just your own outlet where you can only get that piece of content. How do you get through those humps?
Yeah. So the best use case for a large newsroom that's has no interest in republishing is that these are usually they're grant funded outlets who are producing under or they're publishing under Creative Commons licenses.
Mhm.
And so their problem is they just need to get their stuff out as far as possible. They just need reprints, and they need to know where those reprints went. And that's because they just need these for their impact reports. So
Mhm.
a great example of this is like the state's newsroom network, which you may
Right.
be familiar with. So
Mhm.
they do excellent work all over the country, and they very generous. Like just their business model allows them to share their stories freely. So one of their problems is that they currently only the only way they can know that a story was republished is if a small outlet manages to use their pixel tracker.
Oh.
So yeah, so you just sort of that reaction to pixel trackers is like, oh, so
Yeah.
you've worked with them before. Yeah. So so unfortunately, as you know, they're not super reliable. And that's largely because of user issues, just where like a small newsroom, they're not easy to install pixel
Right.
trackers a lot of the time. And so they usually get stripped out, even if the editor is trying their hardest to get it included. Sometimes for technical reasons, it just won't go through. So that means that for a small digital outlet, that means that the big national outlet has to then pay like a PR monitoring firm or set up a
Mhm.
crazy system of Google alerts or pay staff time more usually to go and find stories at the end of the year to put together a list to put into their impact reports. Plucky saves you all of that because everything isn't tracked internally. State's newsroom would know not only every single editor who looked at any of their stories, which is a way for them to gauge interest on which stories might be approaching the threshold of being worth republishing, but not quite. And they also get the information on who actually downloaded the stories and ran them in their publication. So that right there, that turns, even if we just think of it as the staff time, the amount of staff time that they just saved we have an analytics page. You just look at that, and in 10 seconds, you know your baseline analytics for the whole year.
Mhm.
That compared to any amount of staff time is already
That's
starting
huge.
to be a compelling argument.
Well, and
So,
I wanted to ask you about analytics and how you're tracking it and because everybody wants to know their efficacy. So, um, tell me a little bit about analytics, and then also Plucky started relatively recently, but you're already adding a lot. So, sort of how's that trajectory going?
yeah. So, first on the analytics. So, our mindset is that we want to provide very, very low cost and reliable analytics to people. So, that means that we're starting with the internal analytics that I just described, focusing on views and downloads within the system. So as you might already be wondering, so one of the benefits of that tracking those downloads is that we can cover print outlets as well. So
Mhm.
if State's Newsroom has a story that is run by, like we just started working with some of the outlets in New Jersey that are just print outlets. So if New Jersey Monitor puts out a great story and it runs in print, at this moment, State's Newsroom would never have any clue that that happened because it's
Mhm.
print. And like, how does a pixel tracker work in print? I don't know.
Right.
So we would get you that statistic, but as you know, in many cases with small newsrooms, layout decisions have to happen very last minute. So you
Mhm.
might download a story and then realize, oh, like we just can't run this for whatever
Yeah, I was
reasons.
curious, like, how do you know like, I can see how you could automatically track, like, "Oh, I've downloaded this," but what if I wanna have a couple options and I don't know what I'm gonna run? How do you figure
Right.
that out?
Yeah. So the way that we handle that right now is that if someone downloads it, then they're automatically getting signed up for correction alerts.
Mhm,
So they will receive those scary emails when those go out as soon as they happen. But we also have a way for you to tell us that you didn't actually run that story. So you can indicate that you never ran it, which means that we'll both update the statistics and we'll take you off the scary correction alert list.
mhm,
So it's a low grade incentive for someone to help us know when they've downloaded something and they don't run it. But we know in practice that that happens at least like once a week for the outlets that we work with. So
mhm,
having a way for them to be confident that the only correction alerts we'll receive are ones that we actually ran. That's a meaningful enough incentive for them that they will go in and uncheck that box. So we are adding other features for so we offer our own pixel tracker. I never tell anybody that they should like depend on that for all the reasons we already discussed. But there are some groups of outlets that really want page view level information.
Right.
And so in those outlets, or for those outlets, we're working with the group in New Jersey that I've mentioned. With them, we're building an embedded widget that will go on sites, and that will help with tracking page views. And it will also help with for the few outlets that want automated sharing to happen, where there's no
Mhm.
editorial selection process that happens at the outlet level.
Mhm.
They're just game to run whatever comes into the feed.
Oh,
Some,
interesting.
not very
Okay.
few outlets want that, but some of them do. And
Mhm.
so we will offer that as well. And so if you use that widget, then you'll get all the page view information you need. But the default model is native republication, which is covered by those analytics that I just described. So that was your question about the analytics. And then you asked a second question about sort of where we're at in the trajectory overall.
Right.
So we started like Plucky Works LLC became a thing in December of 2024. So it's been like 15 months or so. And for the first half year or so, we were somewhere around like 80 outlets or so that were registered with us. So it
Mhm.
was mostly like there was a large chunk in the Granite State News Collaborative, and then there are a lot of like sharing curious people that are like interested in what this whole thing is, but
Mhm.
they might not have a convening group that they can join where they can just plug in, like in the Granite State News Collaborative. And so that was going on for a while. And then we started adding larger established groups. And so now we're up to 350 outlets now that are registered.
Mhm.
A lot of them are not in formal groups yet. And so Plucky is not super, super useful to them yet, just because a lot of the best content right now is getting shared within closed groups, like local to local outlet. So
Sure.
what we're spending a lot of our time doing now is helping helping groups like the state's newsroom get onboarded because their stuff is nationally relevant and
Mhm.
everybody would benefit from having better access to their stuff, and helping new collaboratives form. So there's a there are some groups. There's a group in Washington State that went from 0 outlets to like 70 outlets in like
That's
6 weeks
great.
or something. Yeah,
Mhm.
they've done incredible work out of Washington State University, and where I'm working with them and with a couple other groups to start figuring out what's the cookbook for starting a collaborative up very quickly. Like what are those questions that have to be asked early on
Mhm.
in a collaborative to guarantee its success? And so as we were talking before we started recording, by far the most important question in any collaborative environment is what are the news holes that actually have to get filled? A
Mhm.
surprising number of large national nonprofits don't ever ask that question to the small
Oh, right.
newsrooms.
Mhm.
And like, they do excellent work, but their excellent work might just never be a good fit for republication. And you would only know that if it's going to be a good one if you ask that question to start. But if you
So
ask
now
that question,
how are you asking that question? Are you sort of guiding and saying, here's, if you have a convener or a group, here's how you find where the news holes are, or is it just, you take suggestions? How are you doing that?
a lot of it is people just calling editors and figuring it out. So and a lot of, I mean, some of them are pretty obvious. Like in
Mhm.
Washington State, for example, there's a legislative session going on right now. And so everybody needs some level of legislative coverage.
Right.
And the AP is not going to, like, the AP just doesn't have great state level coverage anymore.
And they're not going to take requests.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a fair point also. So for a small newsroom to have access to free state house coverage that is it can be responsive to their needs. At least there's a pretense of it being responsive. You
Mhm.
get that with the Murrow Fellowship that they have in Washington State right now. So there is a reporter that's been assigned to cover the state house, and all of their stories will be public domain. And so the way that in collaborative came together was that they recognized very quickly that this person's reporting is um, is going to be valuable to everybody. And so this is the calling card. Like every collaborative
Mm.
does better when there's an editorial focus to start, because then Jody, who runs the group there, could email everybody and say, you should sign up for this because it will give you this kind of coverage. And
Right,
it's very easy for an editor to then decide, is this actually going to help me or not? So
right.
the Murrow Fellowship, they have reporters who cover a lot of different parts of the state, and so they were providing sort of general coverage, but
Mhm.
this state level coverage has been really, really valuable, and they're going to expand it in all sorts of exciting ways. But they found that that editorial focus to start was really key to it getting going.
Right. Well, and I think also like the platform that you have now, because it's sort of an agnostic platform, the platform doesn't care whether it's a photo or a file or maybe a data set. How are you expanding in that way?
Yeah, so we just started making it much easier to share photos independent of stories.
Hmm.
So one of the things that has proven really, really valuable for especially new collaboratives is the stock photo library feature that we offer.
Hmm.
So like in New Hampshire, they had been sharing photos associated with stories for the last 6 years. So just in the last 16 or 18 months, because they'd been using it, they were the very first user and they were starting to upload stories early. Um, since then they've shared like 20,000 photos, I think, just in New
Wow.
Hampshire. And so we weren't thinking very hard about that. But then in New Jersey, they were telling me, we really need a statewide photo library, a stock photo library, so everybody can benefit from that, and they don't have to deal with the different wire services or
Hmm.
the wild west of the different stock photo services online. So we added a photo browser feature that now anytime you need to post a photo of Governor Kelly Ayotte or the AG or the Supreme Court, definitely have a couple hundred photos on any of those topics that are already in the library. And because those photos have already been shared, you can pull them knowing that the rights are clear, and you'll be able to rerun it locally. So that photo thing, that has turned out to be, for many of the young outlets, much more useful and a better selling point than the stories themselves, because stories come with all sorts of editorial baggage where a
Right.
I mean, that's a good thing and a bad thing. So
Right. Like, is it the right angle or is it to your community? I mean, like, yes, that is very,
right.
that can be a little bit more complex.
Right. And like, do I trust that editorial process enough to take on liability running that story? You know,
Hmm.
but with a photo, it's much more self-evident, sort of what you're getting yourself into. And and so that has ended up being really helpful. The other sorts of media that you're asking about, data sets, I don't think we
I could
just
see that
barely
would be hard. I was just curious though.
yeah, that's not something that we do natively right now.
Hmm.
We make it easy for people to share like data wrapper, because that's such a common thing that people share. So you
Hmm.
can share embeds for data wrapper and document cloud, YouTube, all through the platform. And we're adding other ones for like Spotify, Podbean, the different like podcasts get shared through embedded platforms a lot,
Hmm.
or embedded through embeds a lot. But the data sets, um, we haven't had a ton of people that try to do that,
Hmm.
and I don't, based on how things are going, I don't expect that that will be a big thing.
Hmm.
In part because the technical, like so many of the small newsrooms do not have a tech person at all.
Right.
Like there's no way they're going to run like linear regression on a new data set. Like that's just not going to happen. They mostly want to take finished data products and rerun them.
Hmm.
So, so there are a couple of people like in our orbit generally who I am talking to about data things and like, would it make sense to share data sets through this? But currently, it's definitely not a priority.
Hmm. Now, and I guess because it's all Creative Commons licensing, if a producer, if a for-profit producer wanted to post their stories, they would have to agree to the Creative Commons license. Is that how that works? Because we've talked a lot about how the producers are really normally nonprofits or grant driven, and so they're looking for dissemination more than anything else. But how would that work for a differently organized newsroom?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of nonprofits understandably, they should not be publishing too much under Creative Commons because then like that gets a little, that gets tough to maintain your competitive edge when you do that too much.
Right.
So, so, um, many outlets do post under Creative Commons, but we let you bring whatever license you want. The reason why we encourage Creative Commons is that everybody knows it and it cuts down on the lawyer time that's
Mhm.
involved in any sort of republication. But it's not fit for every situation. And
Mhm.
so like in New Hampshire, they have their own license that they put together. So everything is shared under under a specific 14-page agreement that works for New Hampshire. New Jersey's writing their own. Other groups will write their own. And you can apply those licenses to every photo, every story. You could mix that with Creative Commons licenses if you wanted to. Every piece of media has has a license attached to it. So it allows for situations where, say, um, like you have a this is something we're working on, or we were just talking about the other day, that in a group you might have photos that are shot by staff photographers, but they're getting mixed with freelance photographers.
Right.
And that gets kind of gnarly if you're not paying attention. And so what we can do is we can uh, associate different licenses with each of those photos, so that when an editor goes to search for stuff, they can just opt out of anything that doesn't have one of the standard licenses that they know they're comfortable with. Because as you can imagine, freelance photographers, as is their right, they can put whatever sort of terms on it they want, as long as there are lots of different versions of what freelancers will negotiate. But
Mhm.
for a small newsroom, they might not have the energy or the desire to read through those license agreements and decide, like, it's 11:30 p.m. Like, I haven't had enough coffee today.
Right.
Can
I
I
just need something.
understand
Yeah.
this legalese? Like, probably
Uh-huh.
not. So we make it possible for you to opt out of that completely and just look at the easy licenses if you want to.
Mhm.
But we let you use whatever license you want.
Now, like on more complex licenses, like I'm just putting my feet into the shoes of a freelance photographer where I want to get paid for every time that photo is published. Do you have a mechanism for that, or do they? Because I understood the model to be more that the subscriber, the person who's picking up the content, then pays a fee for for the privilege, whether it's a subscription or a one off. But for a situation like a freelance photographer, that could be really different. Does that how do you manage that? Or is that
So
just not the focus?
no, we're building to that because so we currently don't have a mechanism for a freelancer to put their own fee on a photo, but
Mhm,
it's so obvious that is going to be useful to freelance photographers at some
mhm,
level if they are in a large enough market where where there is a market for that, then we want the freelance photographers to make as much money as people are willing to pay them.
mhm,
So what we are building towards, so we're working with this group in New Jersey on this specifically because photos are a really important part of how they're imagining the sharing environment in New Jersey.
mhm,
That we will have people uploading into this stock library that has really permissive licensing, but then people can also upload the freelance photos, and we'll be able to set it up so that after like 2 weeks exclusivity or some 2 week,
mhm,
whatever, then to republish this photo, it's a $50 fee or something that is
mhm.
between the republishing outlet and the freelance photographer. The
Got
freelance
it. Mhm,
photographer would set that fee, and Plucky might take a cut to make sure we can sustain the service. But as much as possible, we're trying to route the money back to
mhm.
the freelancer. And you can
So
imagine, go ahead,
no, go
sorry.
ahead.
You can imagine the same thing happening for stories on
Mhm,
lots of times small newsrooms are not the ones breaking news or in the
right.
area. They're not in a position to do that. But every once in a while they are. And when they are, they should be able to get the maximum benefit from that. So a lot of newsrooms now, to take advantage of that moment, they'll just make all of they'll take out, they'll remove the important stories from behind a paywall and then let other newsrooms come in and scrape them or something like that.
Mhm.
But we would like to let them, for example, sell their content upstream. There's got to be a price point where a mid like a metro newspaper would be willing to pay a small local newspaper that broke a story. At some level, there is a price that would work for them that would be more efficient than having the metro do a rewrite, let's say, or something like
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
So I'm very motivated by figuring out ways to help get a little more money in the pockets of the really tiny newsrooms. And so this is one of the ways that we're building to give them the option. Like it will not be useful for a lot of them, but
Mhm.
um, we want that option because there currently isn't really a market for this, but we want to see if there would be, and we want to see if this is a way that the small newsrooms could get a little extra support.
Well, and I love that you're starting out with it. It sort of feels almost like you're going with that idea of like, what are the editorial holes? You're also looking for like, what are the actual needs of the newsrooms you're trying to serve? And I
Yeah.
know we're coming close on time, and I wish we had longer to talk, but yeah, schedules are what they are. How did you come into this work? I mean, you were doing your history doctorate. You've always been journalism adjacent. And you're not a software coder. How did you wind up doing what you're doing now?
So the so I'll tell you just sort of the it doesn't make sense when I try to analyze it, but I'll
I
tell you
love
the
stories that don't make
chronology.
sense.
so,
Perfect.
so so I finished undergrad and I worked in documentary films, and so that I was never doing like hardcore journalism documentaries, but I was always like hanging out in the same rooms as the really intrepid like foreign correspondents, and so I did that for 5 years, and then I was like, oh, I should be that foreign correspondent, which like if you got to know me more, you'd know like Johnny, you're not cut out for that. You're like, you're, but I was in my mid 20s, and that's a great time to be delusional. And so I flew to Vietnam to edit a film there, and then when I finished that, I thought, oh, this is my chance. I'll go to the Philippines and I'll make a short documentary about the drug war there that was happening at
Mm,
that time.
mhm.
So I thought I would go there for just 6 weeks, like make a little documentary, and then by then I should be famous, and so then I'll have a whole
Well,
nother
of
career.
course. 8
Yeah.
weeks tops.
So I went there, and as an American who didn't know much about the colonial history, that was already really eye opening. This was
Mhm,
also at the beginning of the Trump era, and so
mm,
hearing Filipinos talk about Trump was fascinating, and hearing Filipinos talk about Duterte, who is the name of their president who was running this drug war, those were
mhm,
some of the most interesting conversations I've ever had. Period.
mm,
And I realized this was not a 6 week interest. And so I stayed for about 10 months in the first go. I started learning Filipino. And then I realized no newsroom was going to pay me to ask the questions that I was most interested in,
mhm,
which were why did 90% of Filipinos support Duterte, even though they knew about these killings and they assumed he was behind them. And so a PhD was just a way for me to investigate that interest
mhm.
and basically to learn how to read and write again. Because, like, as a film editor, I didn't really read or write anymore. And that
Well,
was
but
getting
visual
embarrassing.
communication, yeah.
So, the way I got to coding, though, was that when I went back so Davao is the city in the southern Philippines where Duterte is from. And I was in Davao and I realized that by far the best source for any historical research into the early days of the drug war and the death squads that Duterte was accused of running was local newspapers. And
Mm,
so there was a university there that had a storage closet with like 500,000 pages of like molding newspapers.
oh, wow.
And
That's like history disintegrating right before your
yeah,
eyes.
so I knew one, there was no way I was going to have time to read 500,000 pages. And because I had to get married, I needed to come back to the States to marry my wife. So that was important. And
Mhm,
I'm glad I stuck to that. But that was a great reason to learn how to code because when I could start building pipelines that would help with the digitization process, then that's when it became feasible. And so I was able to work with local folks there through the library to help me digitize stuff. And AI tools were just coming out. So coding was much more accessible to someone like me than it had ever been before.
mhm.
And what we ended up with was the largest digital newspaper library in the Philippines.
Oh,
that was
fascinating.
it's very janky. I'm
Mhm,
shocked that it still works, but it's been useful to people all over the country and
mhm.
outside who investigate different parts of the drug war. And all that meant was by the end of that, I'd been volunteering with the newspapers in New Hampshire for a while. And when we finished that, I realized that a lot of the problems that the small newsrooms are facing technologically are not that they're not that hard. They just you have to know a little bit of coding to be dangerous.
Well, and
And
it's insurmountable when you're the only one, like, when you have all the little bits not
right,
connecting.
right. But like if Google wanted to build these tools, they could build them like in half a day, like no problem. But they're not interested and they don't understand the small newsrooms very well. And
Mhm,
many of the larger groups that do produce software for small newsrooms, I mean, there are very few and they tend to miss the mark. So the thing that gave Melanie and I confidence to start this was that I've have worked very closely with editors. I've done some of my own journalism. I've spent a really long time thinking like as a like a historian is like a slow, boring investigative journalist. And so I'm very familiar with the edit with that sort of workflow and how you have to think through questions. And so I can
mhm,
do the translation from editorial practices into code. I can do that. And because the coding part is really not the hard part in this. The translation is.
mhm.
That's what gave us confidence to do this. So now, thankfully, I have people who are much, much better than I am at all the coding stuff. And we work together. So the conversations I still enjoy the most are when I work with editors and I get to understand their editorial problems, because these are the things that get me really excited. I really love talking to the newsroom editors about how they pick stories and how they find stories and just
Sure.
all that kind of thing. So that's how we got to this. This is
I
not at all what I thought I'd be doing, but I love it. So
Well, but it's so related because I think when you're a documentarian, you're really kind of in the nitty-gritty minutia of the story, and
yeah,
then bringing it synthesizing it and bringing it out and sharing it. So this feels like a really good step in your evolution, and I can't wait to hear more about, how Plucky Works is gonna be used across the country because I really do feel like it's a wonder in some ways, it's, you're capturing all that content, and keeping it in one spot. It's like one big digital collection in some ways.
yeah.
So I'm excited to hear more about it as it evolves. And thank you so much for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.